It was mid-1945, and the Japanese Empire was digging in for a final cataclysmic battle. The plan was called Ketsugo, the decisive battle for the homeland. On the southern island of Kyushu, the Imperial Army had buried thousands of troops in fortified caves and hillside bunkers. They had hidden nearly 10,000 kamikaze aircraft, suicide boats, and human torpedoes, all waiting for the American invasion fleet. Every available man, woman, and child was being drilled to fight with bamboo spears if the enemy reached their villages. The Japanese High Command truly believed they could inflict such terrible losses that the Americans would sue for peace rather than conquer the home islands. But on a small coral island called Guam, something else was taking shape. The 315th Bomb Wing had arrived with a new kind of weapon, the B-29B Superfortress. These were stripped-down bombers, their guns removed to make room for extra fuel and bombs. Each plane carried an advanced radar system called Eagle, which let them find and destroy targets through solid cloud cover and in the dead of night. On June 15, 1945, the wing launched its first combat mission, a shakedown strike against Truk Atoll. For the crews, it was a test of endurance, flying nearly 3,000 miles round trip over open ocean. One pilot, Lieutenant Carl Scharrer, sat in the left seat of a Superfort named the Boomerang. Beside him, Sergeant Jim Smith hunched over his radio set, listening to the steady drone of the engines and the crackle of Japanese jamming signals. They were learning to push their machines to the absolute limit. 11 days later, on June 26th, Scharrer and his crew flew their first mission against the Japanese home islands. Their target was the Utsube River oil refinery near Yokkaichi, a vital piece of Japan's shrinking fuel supply. The Americans had realized that if they could starve the Japanese war machine of oil, the planes, tanks, and ships would all grind to a halt. So the 315th Wing was given a single relentless task: night after night, strike the refineries. The Boomerang climbed to altitude, crossed the coast, and dropped its bombs through a haze of searchlights and black flak bursts. It was the start of a long, grinding campaign, one that would push the crews to the edge of exhaustion. But as Smith and Scharrer flew back over the dark Pacific, they had no way of knowing that their mission was threading a narrow path through a much larger story. It was a story that would end with a desperate coup inside the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. In the pre-dawn darkness of July 16th, a team of scientists and engineers gathered in the desolate Jornada del Muerto desert of New Mexico. At the center of their makeshift camp stood a 100-foot steel tower, and atop it rested a sphere of plutonium wired with high explosives. At 5:29 in the morning, the detonation ripped across the desert floor, turning night into day for a blinding instant. The fireball rose, swelling to a mile across, and the sand beneath it melted into green glass. One physicist who watched from the observation bunker later wrote that the device had worked beyond all expectations. The plutonium core, a sphere barely the size of a grapefruit, had unleashed a force equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. The atomic age had begun. The next day, Harry S. Truman arrived in the Berlin suburb of Potsdam for his first meeting with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. The war in Europe was finished, but the struggle against Japan still consumed the Pacific. Truman carried with him the knowledge of the successful test, though he told Stalin only that the United States possessed a new weapon of unusual power. On July 26, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, a direct ultimatum demanding Japan's unconditional surrender. The alternative, they warned, would be prompt and utter destruction. The Japanese government, still hoping for a negotiated peace through Soviet mediation, chose to ignore the demand, and Prime Minister Suzuki told the press that Japan would kill the declaration with silence. On the night of August 5th, Scherer and his crew climbed back into the Boomerang for another mission against the Japanese home islands. Their target was the Ube coal liquefaction plant on the coast of southern Honshu, and the bombing run was rough, with searchlights pinning the bomber and flak bursting close enough to rattle the airframe. On the return leg, the fuel gauges dropped fast, and the number 3 engine began to backfire, coughing and popping in the darkness. Smith leaned forward, listening to the sputtering engine as the long flight home stretched into hours. Scharrer worked the throttles carefully, nursing every drop of fuel while the rest of the crew prepared for a possible ditching. The plane touched down at Northwest Field with fumes in the tanks, and one engine died on the taxiway as they rolled toward the hard stand. While the Boomerang was making its fuel-starved return flight from Ubi, On the island of Tinian, a different B-29 sat at the end of a long runway. The aircraft was called the Enola Gay, and it belonged to the 509th Composite Group, a unit that had trained in secret for months. Loaded into its bomb bay was a single weapon, weighing nearly 10,000 pounds, a uranium bomb known as Little Boy. Colonel Paul Tibbets ran the engines up to full power and released the brakes, and the heavy bomber began its takeoff roll into the night sky. The target was the city of Hiroshima, a major military and industrial center on the island of Honshu. The crew knew they were carrying something unprecedented, something that could change the course of the war in a single blow. The mission had begun. On the morning of August 6th, the B-29 Enola Gay reached its target over Hiroshima. The uranium bomb called Little Boy dropped from the bomb bay at 31,000 feet. 43 seconds later, a blinding flash turned the city into an inferno. Nearly 80,000 people died in that single moment. Their shadows burned into stone bridges and building walls. The mushroom cloud rose to 50,000 feet, visible for 200 miles. President Harry Truman received the news aboard the cruiser USS Augusta in the mid-Atlantic. He released a statement that same day, warning that the force that had destroyed Hiroshima was only the beginning. He told the Japanese people to expect a rain of ruin from the air if they did not surrender. The world understood that a new age of warfare had begun. In Tokyo, the shock of Hiroshima hit the Supreme Council like a physical blow. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo argued that the time had come to accept the Potsdam terms. The military leadership, however, refused to yield. General Korechika Anami, the war minister, insisted that Japan could still fight a decisive battle on its own soil. The full cabinet met that day but reached no agreement. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb called Fat Man fell on Nagasaki. 40,000 people died in an instant. On that same day, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and poured its armies into Manchuria. Japan now faced destruction from the air and invasion from the north. The twin hammer blows fractured any hope of a negotiated settlement. That same night, the 315th Bomb Wing launched another maximum effort strike against the Empire. The boomerang took off from Northwest Field, carrying a full bomb load toward the Nippon Oil Company refinery at Amagasaki near Osaka. As the bomber stream approached the target, searchlights swept across the sky and flak batteries opened fire with concentrated fury. Over the target, the night erupted with bursting shells that rocked the heavy bomber. After dropping its bombs and turning south for home, the plane suffered explosive decompression at 27,000 feet. The crew scrambled for oxygen masks as the cabin air screamed into the thin atmosphere. Navigator Tony Cosola grabbed a portable oxygen tank and crawled through the dark tunnel to find two scanners suffering from hypoxia. He reconnected their hoses and stayed with them until they recovered. The boomerang landed safely back at Guam, but every man aboard was drained to the bone. On the morning of August 10th, the Japanese Supreme Council for the direction of the war met in the Prime Minister's bomb shelter. The 6 members split evenly, 3 for peace and 3 for war. With the cabinet deadlocked, only one authority could break the tie. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki requested an imperial conference, asking Emperor Hirohito to make a final decision. In the stifling heat of the underground shelter beside the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito faced his military and civilian leaders. He spoke in a strained voice, his words halting but clear. He declared that the time had come to accept the Allied terms, to bear the unbearable. The war must end now, whatever the cost to his throne. The men in the room wept openly as they heard their sovereign command surrender. Within hours, the Foreign Ministry transmitted a cable to the Allies accepting the Potsdam Declaration. With one condition, the Emperor's status must not be prejudiced. But inside the War Ministry on Ichigaya Heights, the reaction was fury. General Korechika Anami, the war minister, seethed at the betrayal of everything the army had fought for. Gathering around him were staff officers who shared his rage, including Major Kenji Hatanaka, a fanatical young officer already planning a desperate rebellion. The first threads of a coup d'etat were being woven in the shadows of a defeated capital. On August 11th, 15 young officers from the War Ministry gathered in the concrete air raid shelter on Ichigaya Heights. They were desperate men sworn to defend the emperor, and they had just learned their government had offered to surrender. The shelter smelled of damp concrete and stale sweat. Major Kenji Hatanaka stood among them, his pale face set in grim determination. These officers planned to seize the imperial palace, isolate the emperor, and prevent the surrender from ever taking place. The conspirators believed that War Minister Korechika Anami was on their side. They knew he had fought bitterly against surrender at the imperial conference the night before. If they could hold the emperor incommunicado and issue orders in his name, the entire Japanese army would rally to continue the war. Hatanaka and his comrades left the shelter that evening with a bold plan. Surround the palace, capture the surrender recordings, and force the nation to fight on. The next day, the Japanese cabinet met to debate the Allied reply, the Burns Note. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo argued that the note was acceptable and that Japan must accept the Potsdam terms. But General Anami stood firm, demanding that the Allies guarantee the emperor's sovereignty and prevent occupation of the homeland. The cabinet deadlocked, 10 ministers against 3, with Anami and his allies refusing to yield. While the cabinet argued, Hatanaka and his fellow conspirators worked to win over key military commanders. They approached Colonel Toyojiro Haga of the Imperial Guards Division's 2nd Regiment and found him sympathetic to their cause. The conspirators now had troops inside the palace walls. The stage was set for a rebellion that could tear Japan apart and prolong the war indefinitely. In Washington, President Harry S. Truman was losing patience. No official reply had come from Tokyo, only vague signals and stalling. General George C. Marshall sent an urgent radiogram to General Karl Spaatz on Guam, relaying the president's order. Resume full B-29 operations immediately. The message was clear. Go ahead with everything we have got. The bombing campaign would continue until Japan surrendered or was destroyed. On Guam, the 315th Bomb Wing was placed on standby for a maximum effort mission. Sergeant Jim Smith and the crew of the Boomerang knew what that meant. They would fly again, this time to the northernmost oil refinery in Japan at Akita. The mission would be the longest of the war, nearly 3,800 miles round trip. There would be no bomb bay fuel tanks, and every gallon of gas would have to be stretched to the limit. Just after dawn on August 14th, with the cabinet still deadlocked and the Allies growing impatient, Emperor Hirohito took the unprecedented step of calling a second imperial conference himself. The full cabinet and senior military leaders assembled once more in the stifling air raid shelter beside the Gobunko. Unlike the first conference 4 days earlier, when he had asked them to accept defeat, now he commanded them. There would be no more debate, no further delay. With tears streaming down his face, Hirohito ordered them to accept the Potsdam Declaration and draft the imperial rescript of surrender immediately. The cabinet began drafting the rescript, while NHK technicians set up recording equipment in the Imperial Household Ministry. General Anami attended the meeting, his face unreadable. He had not given up hope. That afternoon, he told his adjutant that he wanted to launch a final kamikaze strike against the American fleet before peace could be declared. But the Emperor's decision held, and the rescript moved toward completion. At 2:49 p.m. Tokyo time, the Dome news agency broadcast a flash bulletin. Japan was about to accept the Potsdam Declaration. The message reached Guam at 3:49 p.m., just as the 315th Wing was starting its engines. General Spaatz ordered the planes to shut down and wait. For 53 minutes, the crews sat on the runway unsure whether they would fly or not. Then the order came. Proceed, the Akita mission was on. In Tokyo, General Anami returned to his residence, still considering his options. Major Hatanaka moved through the darkening streets, gathering his troops. The Imperial Guards Division was preparing to surround the palace. The northbound B-29s of the 315th Wing had already been detected by Japanese radar, and air raid sirens began to wail across the capital. The blackout that fell over Tokyo that night would change everything. The Boomerang shuddered as it crossed the coast of northern Honshu, the night sky ahead glowing with the orange pulse of burning oil tanks. The Nippon Oil Company refinery at Akita was already a cauldron of flame from the lead bombers, columns of black smoke climbing past 20,000 feet. Sergeant Jim Smith hunched at his radio table, scanning for fighters through the glare of searchlights that swept the bomber stream in Tokyo. The darkness was absolute. Major Kenji Hatanaka and Lieutenant Colonel Jiro Shiozaki pushed their way into the office of General Takeshi Mori, commander of the Imperial Guards Division, deep inside the northern quadrant of the Imperial Palace. Hatanaka demanded Mori's support for the coup, but the general refused, stating he would follow only the emperor's wishes. Captain Shigetaro Uehara lunged forward, his samurai sword cutting down Mori's brother-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel Michinori Shirashi, who tried to shield him. Hatanaka drew his pistol and fired a single round into Mori's chest. With the general dead, the rebels forged Division Strategic Order No. 5884, stamped it with Mori's official seal, and dispatched runners to mobilize the regiments. By midnight, troops surrounded the palace grounds, the gates were barred, and the emperor was effectively a prisoner in his own home. The boomerang nosed into the bomb run, and the air around the plane turned violent with flak bursts and thermal updrafts from the inferno below. A second superfortress appeared directly above them, so close that Smith could see the nestled bombs in its open bay. Shara banked hard left to avoid collision just as the intervalometer triggered the release, and their 100-pound bombs streamed down toward the blazing storage tanks. Inside the Imperial Household Ministry, rebels stumbled through pitch-black corridors, their flashlights dying as they searched room after room for the wax recordings of the Imperial rescript. The blackout triggered by the American bombers made the search nearly impossible. Soldiers dragged Kenjiro Yabe of NHK from the detention shed, hoping he could identify the chamberlain who had taken the recordings. But the darkness and Yabe's unfamiliarity with the palace bureaucracy prevented him from pointing out the right man, leaving the rebels to continue their frantic search through shattered furniture and scattered papers, never finding the safe concealed behind a pile of paperwork. By dawn, word of the murder of General Mori had reached Eastern District Army headquarters. Lieutenant General Shizuichi Tanaka drove directly to the palace and confronted the rebels, ordering them to disband. Hatanaka slipped away and raced to the NHK studios, demanding airtime to broadcast a call for nationwide revolt. The NHK announcer Morio Tateno refused, citing the continuing air raid alert. Realizing the coup had failed, Hatanaka met Shiozaki in the plaza near the double bridge, scattered their remaining leaflets, and raised a pistol to his forehead. Shiozaki knelt toward the palace, slashed open his belly, and shot himself. Both died facing the emperor. At his residence near the Western Moat, War Minister Korichika Anami had spent the night drinking sake with his brother-in-law, waiting in silence to learn the fate of the rebellion. When word arrived that General Tanaka had crushed the uprising, Anami stripped to the waist, wrapped his torso in white cotton, and put on the linen shirt the emperor had given him years before. He knelt on the veranda facing the imperial palace, drew a short sword across his abdomen, and cut his own throat. The act of seppuku took nearly 4 hours to complete. A medical orderly finally administered a fatal dose of morphine. Some 4,000 miles to the south, the boomerang was running out of fuel. Flight engineer Hank Gorder had been milking the cruise control all the way south from Akita, leaning the mixture until the engines backfired. The number 3 engine coughed and sputtered, and the crew assumed ditching positions, knowing fuel was critically low. Shara brought the heavy bomber over the cliff at Northwest Field with the fuel gauges reading empty. The main gear touched the asphalt, and as they rolled toward the hard stand, the number 3 engine sputtered and died, completely dry. The crew sat in silence for a long moment. Then the radio crackled with the news. Japan had surrendered. President Truman had announced it from the White House. The war was over. At noon in Tokyo, NHK announcer Nobukata Wada introduced the broadcast of the highest importance. For the first time in history, the Japanese people heard the voice of their emperor speaking in the formal language of the court. Hirohito read the imperial rescript, commanding his subjects to endure the unendurable and accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. The broadcast shattered the fighting spirit of the armed forces. At Eitsugi Air Base, Captain Yasuna Kozono had prepared a mass kamikaze strike on the American Third Fleet, but the emperor's words undercut his authority. His pilots refused to attack. A few diehards took to the skies to drop leaflets denouncing the surrender, but the rebellion was finished, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, commander of the kamikaze forces on Kyushu, refused to accept defeat. He led 11 dive bombers from Owaida Air Base at sunset on August 15th, heading south toward Okinawa. He radioed his intention to crash into the enemy fleet, then vanished without a trace. No American ship reported any attack that night. The last kamikaze mission of the war simply disappeared into the Pacific darkness. On September 2nd, the formal surrender ceremony took place on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur stood before a long table covered in green felt, flanked by representatives of the Allied powers. The Japanese delegation, led by Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu and Army Chief of Staff General Yoshijiro Umezu, signed the instrument of surrender. MacArthur closed the proceedings with a brief address calling for peace and justice as he finished formations of American warplanes, from B-29 superfortresses to carrier-based Hellcats, thundered low overhead, filling the sky with sound. The most costly conflict in human history had reached its end. The war that had begun with a surprise attack at Pearl Harbor ended with a quiet signing ceremony in a calm bay. The men of the 315th Bomb Wing, who had flown the longest mission of the war on the night the Emperor recorded his rescript, began the long journey home. Navigator Tony Casola, who had risked his life to save his crewmates from hypoxia, also came home to begin a new life in peacetime. For Sergeant Jim Smith, the final mission was his last flight over enemy territory. He returned to Nebraska and carried the memory of that long night for the rest of his life. Japan embarked on an occupation that would reshape its society and its place in the world. The connection between a B-29 bombing mission over northern Japan and the failure of a desperate coup in Tokyo is a reminder that history often turns on the smallest details. A radar detection caused a blackout. That blackout cost the rebels precious time, and that lost time allowed a recording of the Emperor's voice to reach the people, ending the war and sparing both nations the terrible cost of invasion. If you have family stories from the Pacific War, or memories passed down from those who served in the final months of the conflict, we would be grateful to hear them in the comments below. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like so we can continue bringing these important stories to light. Thank you for listening and for your support.